exact language and new tools for insight into Beelzebub's tales. Simply to say, after years of reading Gurdjieff's writings, it was Trevor's insight into this exact language that changed the entire nature of my engagement with these writings. So I wish you a very good taking in and of this valuable material, and I wish you good digestion. Carry on, Trevor.
And please, if I could ask everyone to stop their video and to mute. Thank you.
Have you ever had a float?
I can still hear Al and Douglas.
Douglas, if you don't, oh, I'll just stop video. Thanks, Trevor.
Okay. Thank you, Toddy. I wanted to just start by thanking Isaac for playing piano during the conference. It's been really lovely to have that added to the Zoom format, which can seem impersonal. So having music is nice that way. And then also to Steve Apps, maybe this should be reserved for the banquet, but I just want to thank everyone for setting this up, including Steve, because it's been a really valuable experience for me. My name is Trevor Stewart. I'm going to be presenting about Gurdjieff and his exact language, as Toddy intimated. Let me go ahead and bring up my slideshow here. The slideshow is just so that I'm a very visual person, so if it helps people to follow along, that's kind of the intent, or you can just listen. So the presentation as a whole will roughly follow this trajectory. We'll start with looking at quotes from Gurdjieff, both from his writings and his lectures. And then from that, we'll create kind of a new theoretical model or try to understand how those apply to Beelzebub's tales. And from there, we'll explore some possible examples. For those who aren't familiar with this idea, here's like a typical thing Gurdjieff would say. For an exact study, an exact language is needed. So we have him saying this, not just, Gurdjieff was a really creative guy, and he came up with a lot of ideas, and he would create fantastic ideas and explore them with people and then never return to them again. But this is actually not one of those ideas. This is not a passing notion that Gurdjieff came up with. This is something that we have him saying from the beginning in Russia with Uspensky groups, and then it's labeled as one of two essential prerequisites for self-observation in Beelzebub's tales. So in other words, it merits our study or taking a look at this idea. The other requirement for self-observation that he says in Beelzebub's tales is sincerity, which to me is much more intuitive because it stands to reason that there needs to be an ability to be honest with oneself if you're really gonna take a full look at everything that's going on with yourself. But when it comes to an exact language, it's a little less clear why this could be considered essential. I don't know that I'm going to answer that question clearly in this lecture, but hopefully it's something that I can kind of spotlight for others to explore. Of course, Gurdjieff didn't reveal directly what his exact language is. He didn't spell it out. So he left it for us to ponder and discover for ourselves. But I would suggest that he demonstrated this language in Beelzebub's tales. So we're going to look at some snippets here. The first one comes from Gurdjieff's afterword in Beelzebub's tales. I'll go ahead and just read it. In order that the elucidation of these principles regarding self-observation may be properly perceived and transubstantiated in the followers of this new teaching, it is necessary to establish a corresponding form of language, since we find the established form of language quite unsuitable for such elucidations. A little later, he again says, the establishment of a correct language. This is necessary because our still recently established language, which has procured, so to say, rights of citizenship, and in which we speak, convey our knowledge and notions to others, and write books, has, in our opinion, already become such as to be now quite worthless for any more or less exact exchange of opinions. So basically, these passages just show that this is an essential idea for Gurdjieff. But I want to make kind of a caveat that I don't see this as being philosophical jargon. I think alarm bells go off for people when they start hearing words like buffers, identification, and stuff like that in group work, because it just starts to have kind of a lack of a fluid feeling inside of it. So what I'm not saying is that Gurdjieff was trying to establish philosophical terms that could be defined and then used in a repeated manner, you know, in much as we establish jargon in different fields of science. So that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about here is something that I consider to be a much more alive, expressive form of communication. So the next quote we'll do is Gurdjieff, as recorded by Ouspensky. So he says, this new language contains hardly any new terms or new nomenclature, but it bases the construction of speech upon a new principle, namely the principle of relativity. That is to say, it introduces relativity into all concepts and thus makes possible an accurate determination of the angle of thought. For what precisely ordinary language lacks are expressions of relativity. So the thing here that I'm wanting to point out is just this idea of expressions of relativity. Apparently, we don't have adequate expressions in our language that show the angle of thought, where we're actually coming from. Here's Gurdjieff and Views from the Real World. In order to be understood by another man, it is not only necessary for the speaker to know how to speak, but for the listener to know how to listen. This is why I can say that if I were to speak in a way I consider exact, everybody here, with very few exceptions, would think I was crazy. So Gurdjieff here is saying that his exact language would appear crazy to those who don't know how to listen. And this is something he was saying in a lecture before he had written Beelzebub's Tales. And it's interesting that later when he wrote Beelzebub's Tales, when he gave some of the initial transcripts to Araj said, you can't show this to anybody. So there was something that Araj initially found, maybe crazy looking. Ouspensky forbade his students to read Beelzebub's Tales, probably for many reasons, but among them is he was concerned that Gurdjieff in his car accident had a brain injury and maybe wasn't right in the head. Maybe he was crazy. But it's interesting because Gurdjieff saying his exact language would appear crazy, and then we find this really interesting and peculiar form of Beelzebub's Tales, it stands to reason that Beelzebub's Tales would in fact be Gurdjieff's exact language. And there's a kind of a loaded phrase here, how to listen. He says it would be necessary for the listener to know how to listen. And I don't want to limit how we might think about or understand what that means, because there's many ways of looking at that, many levels. But I think there is something that Gurdjieff says in Beelzebub's Tales in this same area from the previous quote that I did that I think bears on this. So I'd like to just visit that here. Owing to the gradual disappearance of the capacity to concentrate his active attention for any length of time, the average man on uttering or hearing any word involuntarily emphasizes and dwells upon this or that aspect of the notion conveyed by the word, invariably concentrating the whole meaning of the word upon one feature of the notion indicated by it. That is to say, the word signifies for him not all the implications of the given idea, but merely the first chance significance dependent upon the ideas formed in the link of automatic associations flowing in him. Owing to the loss of the capacity to ponder and reflect, whenever the contemporary average man hears or employs in conversation any word with which he is familiar only by its consonants, he does not pause to think, nor does there even arise in him any question as to what exactly is meant by this word, he having already decided once and for all, both that he knows it and that others know it too. So here Gurdjieff is saying something about our capacity to reflect on the meanings of words. And obviously we're all constantly gossiping and talking with each other and using language. So we're constantly using words. And he's just pointing out that we have a very difficult time not inserting our own associations into what other people are saying and taking the time to have an extended thought about what something actually means. And in particular here, he says that we don't tend to see all of the implications of a given idea. So there's certain superficiality that we bring to the way that we receive words. So when we put all of these quotes from Gurdjieff together, these are just some of them, but I think they're important ones. I think we get something like this. One, Gurdjieff says that there's a new exact language. Two, that ordinary language is inexact. That's why we need the new language. Three, this new exact language would need to contain expressions of relativity because this is what he said it lacks apparently. Four, this new language would appear mad. And five, it stands to reason that Beelzebub's tales are Gurdjieff's exact language. So one of the questions that comes out of this is, if this is the case, then what are expressions of relativity in the tales? If this is the essential ingredient Gurdjieff is saying from our ordinary language that is creating an inability for us to compress our own web of understanding into the string of words that we use, that then other people have to decompress in their own understanding. This is the essential ingredient that's missing. What is he going to do to fix this? Like he must have some answer for this in Beelzebub's tales. So as you're going to see, this is precisely what I'm going to use to propose a way of looking at some of the textual peculiarities of Beelzebub's tales. And there's the question I just expressed. Okay, so a new theory. Objects and modifiers. So as I was saying, it's like in the tales, every passage is essentially just a series of words and phrases. That's what we're reading. And I would propose to you that each of these words and phrases are essentially of one of two kinds. Either each word or phrase is an object and or it's a modifier. So objects, the reason I use the word objects for this is because object gives the sense of something that can be held, borne in mind, something that place your attention on and it's held there. So it links it to meditation and attention exercises in that way. But it also gets a sense of three-dimensionality. You can take an object and you can move it. You can walk around it. You can split it up into pieces. You can dissect it. You can glue it to other things. You can look at it in relationship to other objects. So it gives a sense of three-dimensionality by using the word object. And objects, I would say, are essentially of four kinds. There may be more that you can think of, but these roughly correspond to like nouns that we learned in grammar school. Objects are generally characters, places, things, or events. So characters are like, some of them are characters that we learn about over the scope of the book, like Ashiata, that we're kind of gradually investigating, or the Akaldins or Belkotasi. Some of them are just flitting images, like the fat-necked cook in America, or the squeaky-voiced tour guide in France. And so characters is one type of object. Something that each of those characters is something we can consider from multiple sides. Secondly, places. So things like Grabancy, Atlantis, Samlios, France, Pearland. Things, a lot of the things in the tales are characters' inventions. So this can be like the Ala Atapan of the Chinese twins, the Momana Duar in Gornahor Harark's lab, the gut strings, you know, on one portion of the Ala Atapan. So, or the amber separating materials in a particular way in Archangel Heriton's ship system. So anything, there's a lot of really peculiar things that Gurdjieff brings up that we can consider from different angles. And then events are things like the first catastrophe, the second Transapoleon perturbation, Chukad Latanical period, or the English military expedition into Tibet that the Lama's council has to, you know, take measures to deal with. So events are another thing that actually can be viewed from multiple perspectives about what they mean. Modifiers, and again, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just examples, so you may come up with your own. But modifiers are essentially what I'm saying Gurdjieff's expressions of relativity are. They're things that we find littered around objects or connected to objects that give us some implication of what those objects might mean. And the first two that I have listed here, quotation marks, I think we'll all be familiar with. You know, 6 to 12 of those on every single page of this book. So it's a very stable textual indication that Gurdjieff is giving us. One that I haven't heard talked about, but you may have noticed, are what-are-calls. These also occur just about as frequently as quotation marks. And I would say quotation marks and what-are-calls both have a similar effect of not always giving you, telling you how to view an object or what angle of thought to be thinking about the object from, but they certainly put the object up in the air. So if you think about your phone and how you have all the little widgets for your apps on your phone, and if you hold your finger on the screen, you know, they all start to vibrate, which means that they're in a state of dynamic. They kind of haven't landed somewhere, and you can shift all of the widgets around freely and kind of reconfigure things. I would submit that these are indications that the object that they're connected to is up in the air, and it's something that the reader should be considering. But obviously, like, you can put quotation marks around hot, and okay, well, it means it's opposite cold. But if you put quotation marks around banana, you know, what's the opposite of a banana? Nobody knows. So quotation marks obviously are not just opposites. So it's not always clear what quotation marks are doing. Other than that, they're telling us that something is not what it appears to be in some way. So the third and fourth here, phrasal parallels and thematic parallels. This is, I'll define those in just a second, because we're going to do an example of each one of those in a minute. But essentially, just to wrap up the theory, it's not a very complex theory, but basically the theory just takes, we're calling Gurdjieff's expressions of relativity modifiers. And then I'm sort of pointing out that obviously this is an allegory, so it's composed of mostly characters, places, things, and events. And it's really how we interpret that material that you know, produces meaning. And there's, of course, many views on whether you can actually confine these objects to a particular meaning or not. But in any case, in terms of Gurdjieff's exact language, it stands to reason that these are the expressions of relativity. And essentially the modifiers are just what we're using. They're the indications that we have about how to view any object under consideration. And they're extremely important because they're actually indicating the particular sequence of the attention exercise in any given tale or passage. So let's look at a couple of examples. We'll look at a phrasal parallel and a thematic parallel. So a phrasal parallel is essentially two or more objects linked by a common word or phrase. So there are hundreds of these examples of these, but I'll look at one, and if it doesn't make sense to someone else, that's fine. You might be able to find other ones that make more sense to you, but there are a lot of these in the tales. And this one comes from chapter 2, Why Beelzebub is in Our Solar System. And I've kind of highlighted what I see as the relevant phrases. So we'll go ahead and just read this. Only a little before this journey, Beelzebub had returned home to the planet Caritas, from where he had received his arising, and far from which, on account of circumstances independent of his own essence, he had passed many years of his existence in conditions not proper to his nature. This many-yeared existence, unsuited to him, together with the perceptions unusual to his nature, and the experiences not proper to his essence involved in it, had not failed to leave on his common presence a perceptible mark. So the first time, I read this, of course, just blew right through it and, did not have an extended thought about the words that I was hearing. But when you kind of even look at it just a little bit further, you start to see some interesting things. The general meaning of this whole section is that Beelzebub has gone somewhere that doesn't correspond in some way to his nature or essence. But if you were to take this down to your community college writing lab, they would immediately point out that there are, according to Bone Tone literary style, there's a redundancy here. All of the phrases in blue, mean a very similar thing, and they would ask you to reduce that to using that idea, that phrase once. What you find in the tales that Gurdjieff uses redundancy as a way to call out to the reader to pay attention to something, oftentimes, but obviously we don't. It may take us a while to notice, but there is a redundancy going on here that's kind of interesting. And just to highlight the phrases, if you look at the blue phrases, he's saying that there are circumstances independent of his own essence and conditions not proper to his nature. Now, I'm sure you could have a hermeneutical discussion and get super metaphysical about essence and nature and get back into the Uspenskian philosophical jargon around some of these terms. But to a common sense person coming to Gurdjieff's book, who's never been in the work, hasn't read anything else, which I think is who Gurdjieff is actually writing to, honestly. Essence and nature are a very similar thing. Your nature, your essence, it's pointing to a similar thing, but calling it by a slightly different word. And again, there may be interesting and necessary differences between those words, but common sense would say these are very similar. But you'll notice in the first paragraph to the second paragraph, there's an interesting shuffling that happens of not proper to. So not proper to goes from being in front of his nature to in front of his essence. So he's kind of swapped essence and nature. And then, just so we can't find an ultimate pattern in all of this, he doesn't reuse independent of, he instead inserts unusual to in the second paragraph. But you can kind of see there's an interesting shuffling going on there. And that also is something that's quite common in his sentence structures. But the first paragraph, really both of the words in red are dealing with something outside of Beelzebub. Circumstances, conditions. And they're both connected to this similar phrase. The second paragraph, both words in red are connected to something we would generally consider to be inside of Beelzebub, his perceptions, his experiences. So we're kind of left with a bit of a contradiction here. Is Beelzebub going somewhere and it's something about the external situations that don't correspond to his nature or essence? Or is this something that's happening in his perceptions and his experiences? And I would submit that one way, this is the first page of his introduction to Beelzebub's tales. So I would submit that this is a really important initial point of contemplation that Gurdjieff is wanting the reader to pick up on, which is something like, does reality exist solidly out there, so to speak? Or to what degree is that something that I'm creating in my own perceptions of it? So if we were to relate this back to the theory explicitly, basically I'm saying that the words in red are objects. They're a bit abstract, maybe a couple of them. Perceptions and experiences, you could say, are like psychological realities, but in any case, these are words that are objects, and we wouldn't necessarily connect them in our minds as we're reading the passage unless we notice the redundancy happening in the blue phrases. And so we're kind of, the blue phrases are causing us to put the contradiction together and produce like a chain of thought for the reader or a point of contemplation. So, so that's a phrasal parallel. And again, I think this is a really important one because from my view, the remaining 1,100 pages of the book is really an extended set of perceptual experiments that the reader can perform about exactly this question, and with guidance about how to inquire into exactly this question about the nature of what is within and what is without. So the second example, a thematic parallel. Thematic parallel is a two or more objects linked by a common theme or context. So we're going to look at two characters and present a view of them as both representing the reader. It's going to be the young Beelzebub and also Hussein. And we'll look at thematic links between the young Beelzebub and Hussein. And then we'll kind of look at why we could consider from one angle that they each represent the reader. And then we'll also, similarly to the last example, we'll look at inexactitudes. So the way that these characters also don't line up and what that implies, what point of contemplation that implies for the reader. So let's just read the places in which these characters are introduced. This is Beelzebub. Long, long before, while Beelzebub was still existing at home on the planet Caritas, he had been taken, owing to his extraordinarily resourceful intelligence, into service on the Sun Absolute, where Lord Sovereign Endlessness has the fundamental place of his dwelling. And there Beelzebub, among others like himself, had become an attendant upon his endlessness. It was just then that, owing to the as yet unformed reason due to his youth, Beelzebub once saw in the government of the world something which seemed to him illogical and interfered in what was none of his business. His intervention soon captured all minds, and the effect was to bring the central kingdom of the megalocosmos almost to the edge of revolution. Here is Hussein being introduced. Among all the passengers aboard the ship, one very handsome boy was conspicuous. He was always near Beelzebub himself. This was Hussein, the son of Beelzebub's favorite son, Toulouf. After his return home from exile, Beelzebub had seen this grandson of his, Hussein, for the first time. And appreciating his good heart, and also owing to what is called family attraction, he took an instant liking to him. And as the time happened to coincide with the time when the reason of little Hussein needed to be developed, Beelzebub, having a great deal of free time there, himself undertook the education of his grandson. And from that time on, took Hussein everywhere about with him. And Hussein, on his side, so loved his grandfather that he would not stir a step without him. And he eagerly absorbed everything his grandfather either said or taught. So there's a lot here. There's words in quotation marks. There's a lot we could go into, but let's go into some thematic links between these characters. So they're both young, and as a result have imperfect reason. They're both taken on. The young Beelzebub is taken on by endlessness, and Hussein is taken on by the old Beelzebub. And that taken on sort of has the quality of master pupil in the sense that endlessness is sort of taking on Beelzebub, and he goes through a journey, and then Beelzebub then evolves up into the old Beelzebub and takes on a new Hussein. And there's an implication that there's a kind of chain of transmission there. But they both go on a educational journey. And it's interesting that Hussein's journey is paralleling and coming about through listening to the journey of the young Beelzebub. Now let's look at reasons why we could, from one view, look at these characters as being the reader. Hussein is fairly intuitive, I think, for most people. Basically, old Beelzebub telling the tales is obviously Gurdjieff writing the tales. So this is the thinly veiled mouthpiece that Gurdjieff has chosen. And therefore, Hussein, in listening, is the reader taking in the tales.
5 minutes, Trevor.
Okay. Beelzebub, it takes a little bit more of an extended thought to think of Beelzebub as the reader. But basically, the reader, like Hussein, in following Beelzebub's journey of transformation, it's sort of implied that we are going to go through some kind of transformative journey ourselves. And in that sense, the stages in Beelzebub's transformation would be, reflected in the reader's experience or the reader's growth through contemplating the book. And Gurdjieff himself said that if you scratch hard enough after the dog he buried, funny thing happens, you become a real man. So there's a sense in which Beelzebub on a journey, we're going on that journey too as the reader. There's also a kind of arrogance to Beelzebub. I mean, he is revolting against government at a very high level, not a local level, a very central level. And so there's an arrogance there. But also in the preface, Gurdjieff characterizes the reader jocularly as a swaggering candidate for a buyer of his writings. So there's an implication that the reader is coming to the book with a certain amount of ego. One of the few explicit metaphors in the book is the Transcaucasian Kurd who eats the bell pepper, it's a very famous image, and subsequently burns. And that, Gurdjieff says, represents what the reader's experience supposedly should be reading the tales. And we sort of see a parallel here where Beelzebub, going to Sun Absolute, finds something he is not expecting, something revolting at the highest level. So there's a thematic parallel there between the Kurd, the reader, and Beelzebub. So there are some things that don't line up. I think these are essential. Among which is, you'll notice that these are just some of them, but Beelzebub is described as being intelligent, whereas Hussein is good-hearted. He doesn't stir a step without his grandfather and is eagerly absorbing what Beelzebub says, whereas the young Beelzebub rejected whatever it was he found on Sun Absolute. So again, Beelzebub is kind of more rejecting and Hussein is more accepting. So if Beelzebub and Hussein both are images for the reader, why does Gurdjieff connect such different qualities to images of the reader? Why does he give us different images of the reader? And one way of thinking about this is that that Beelzebub and Hussein sort of represent the poles of acceptance and rejection, kind of black and white thinking. And the reader can't really just be Hussein. Can't just, on the one hand, the reader needs to take everything in. But on the other hand, the reader needs to show discrimination and also reject quite a lot of what they're being told by the narrator. So rejecting ridiculous ideas in favor of more common sense interpretations. So there's kind of the sense that by giving us two ways to consider our relationship to the author, we have to, in internalizing those images as the reader, we sort of are blending two separate qualities and finding a middle ground, which the result, I would say, would be something like impartial thinking, that there's not just an acceptance or a rejection, but a more prolonged thought about what we are perceiving. And then lastly, kind of one, I think it's interesting if you follow, if this made sense to you, if you kind of follow the track that we went down in thinking about these characters, you'll notice that we expressed exactly the qualities that the knowledge, in coming to the knowledge that these characters represent something about impartial thinking. We also expressed impartial thinking. We took the stories in, we eagerly absorbed everything, but then we didn't just accept a literal meaning. We actually thought about what these characters might represent. And in doing that, we developed a certain amount of impartiality, a certain amount of an ability to see ourselves from multiple sides, to see ourselves as Beelzebub, or to see ourselves as Hussein. So we've become a little bit more psychologically sophisticated in that way, a little bit more metacognitively sophisticated, maybe a little bit more impartial. So there's an interesting way in which we've kind of unknowingly demonstrated some impartial thinking in arriving at the conclusion that this represents impartial thinking. And I brought this up at the 2018 A&E conference, but this is really highly characteristic of objective art as Gurdjieff instantiates it in the tales. In other words, the contemplation of many images has this really interesting quality where the reader has kind of unknowingly done what they end up knowing later. And I would say that's an example of objective art. So having the path and the end of the path are a unitary phenomena in the experience of the reader. And yeah, so those are the two examples that we have, but there's obviously many more. So some overall conclusions from the presentation, and I'll finish up here. So Beelzebub's Tales is Gurdjieff's exact language. I think that's a pretty solid conclusion. The allegories in the book are relative, but they're not random. Rather, I would submit that, and we haven't gone over too many examples here, but I would submit that the passages are like attention exercises that use simultaneity in a way very similar to movements. The modifiers are asking the reader to hold the object in one sense and develop a chain of thought, but then kind of look at it from another sense that develops a second chain of thought that assists the first one further. So there's kind of this element of multiple developing layers going on. And that has deep, actually meditative significance for the quality of our awareness of our own thought processes that I think psychologists would probably find really interesting. In this case, we're sort of bearing things in mind and attending to things using our mind, whereas in the movements, it's obviously more the body is the initial carrier of attention. It's the way that Gurdjieff is testing and prodding the participant to pay attention. In the tails, it's really using your active mind. And that concludes my presentation.